Welcome to Someone Talks, the official podcast of the National D-Day Memorial, where leading experts spill all the secrets of the Second World War. With your host, Dr. John C. McManus.
Greetings. Welcome to Someone Talked. I'm your host, Dr. John C. McManus from Missouri S&T, alongside, as always, are my dear friends and good partners in crime for the Someone Talk podcast, April Cheek Messier and John Long from the National D-Day Memorial Foundation. So, with a little prelude for our guests, it's, of course, Nina Willner, and this is our second episode with her. Nina is the author of two books. One is called 40 Autumns, and the other is The Boys in the Light, an extraordinary World War II story of survival, faith, and brotherhood. Both are very much her own personal family stories. Just by way of a little background, 40 Autumns covers post-war Germany, the split between the two Germanys and how that led to a major split in her family. And her remarkable mother, Hannah, who eventually leaves communist East Germany to start a whole new life in West Germany and everywhere that leads. This book, The Boys in the Light, of course, is the larger and deeper background of her family during World War II, specifically her father, Eddie's journey through concentration camps and beyond. Nina herself, of course, is no stranger to military stories and service. She herself was a U.S. Army intel officer in the 1980s, stationed in Germany, running missions in East Berlin and elsewhere. And she's, just remarkable. So, Nina, thanks for joining us. It's an honor to have you, and we're really looking forward to delving into this book with you a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Yeah, so where we left off with the story in the first episode, of course, your father, whose name was Eddie Willner, and your grandfather, whose name was Siegfried, are in one of the labor camps, the adjacent labor camps to Auschwitz. They were, I guess, quote, lucky enough, to meet selection and be consigned to slave labor. They have, in the meantime, met a man who's going to become, I think it's fair to say, your father's best friend in life, Mike Schwab, a Dutch Jew who has been, consigned to the same labor camp. And so they have formed this really very powerful trio, hoping to lean on one another and survive under the leadership of your grandfather. In the meantime, there's a kind of parallel story, which of course meets eventually, in which you're chronicling the experience of D Company 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, under a rather remarkable officer named Elmer Hovland, and then another really irrepressible character, Pepsi DeCola. his nickname is Pepsi, and he's a unit cook, but obviously, more than that as time goes forward. So let's start with the 3rd Armored Division. Hovland and the guys have been trained up for combat. 3rd Armored Division is one of the two major heavy divisions, the armored divisions that we have during World War II, which means that it's equipped with more tanks than is normal for a U.S. Army armored division during the war. Third Armored Division had a lot of training by the time it goes into Normandy in the summer of 1944. So here these guys are entering France, post D-Day, of course. What are the experiences of Elmer Hovland and his men like during the Battle of Normandy?
Yeah, so as you said, they trained in the States, and then they trained in England, then came ashore at Omaha Beach shortly after D-Day. 140 tankers and support personnel. And D Company drove pretty much right from the beaches straight into combat and found themselves fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy, a terrain, by the way, that they were totally unprepared for. And this is a brand new unit, which had never seen combat before. So a brand new unit, brand new soldiers equipped with the Sherman, which is pretty much a brand new tank. And they make their way first through France, eventually into Belgium in their Sherman tanks, which prove by almost all accounts of the tankers I spoke with to be inferior. And one of those tankers, in fact, told me, quote, German shells seared through the Sherman like a hot knife through butter, while our Sherman rounds bounced off the German Panzers. So the American boys in Company D struggling to fight, all Americans struggling to fight this fanatical and experienced enemy that has more powerful equipment, and were met right from the beginning with a lot of losses in both tanks and soldiers. And so they enter and move through the war initially with a lot of fear and uncertainty. In fact, one company deloader told me just one day in combat, and you could tell we weren't ready. And so they have to they have to do something to give themselves a fighting chance. And so they improvise wherever they can. And thanks to, Yankee ingenuity or cowboy mentality, they do things like lash logs to the side of their tanks, hoping that it'll give them more protection. Meanwhile, Pepsi's doing his best to keep the boys fed. And, they go on after a few weeks of battling the hedgerows. They finally make a breakout at Saint-Lô and race across France. They move just south of Paris and then northward to Belgium, and then ultimately found themselves facing the infamous Dragon's Teeth, which, was this massive concrete and mined barrier with fortified enemy positions that ran, 400 miles from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south, something like that. And, it was an obstacle thought by the Germans to be impenetrable. But the 3rd AD was one of the first units to bust through the Dragon's Teeth and opening up a gateway for the Allies to move into Germany. And so, after surviving their initial war jitters and hard lessons, Company D got better and better as they went along.
Nina, talk a little bit more about Pepsi, because we know what his role, talk a little bit about what his role is with the company. Obviously, he's the cook, but it evolves to be much more than that. It's much deeper than that. Can you talk a little bit about what he felt his responsibility was and how the men, how they loved him?
Yeah, they did love him. Pepsi really becomes the heartbeat of the company. His fix for anything that ails anyone is humor and food, whatever he can cook up. He's a cook, but he also becomes kind of a combat psychologist. And as I said, he's very much this kind of wily, snarky, wisecracking guy with this thick Boston accent. And, he doesn't take much seriously. And he ends up running the kitchen almost like the diner that he left. And he just has a huge heart. And as you'll see in the book, if you haven't read it already, he is sort of the source of a lot of people, balancing a lot of people through this experience as they go through the war. Yeah, he was a great guy.
Yeah. Well, move from a man we can all admire to one who's just an odious character in your book, and known only by a nickname that sums up the inhumanity of the concentration camps, and that nickname was Tom Mix. So tell us about this sociopath, I think, who and how he impacted the story of Eddie and Mike.
Well, there were extremely brutal guards in Auschwitz, in all the Auschwitz camps, as you can imagine. I profiled Tom Mix because he was one of the names that came up over and over again in my research in survivor testimonies. So quite a few survivors faced his incredibly, inhumane wrath. He was especially brutal. He hated Jews. And the inmates called him Tom Mix. So Tom Mix was actually an American actor, a Hollywood cowboy film star who starred in a lot of Westerns. And his films were shown throughout Europe. But while the American actor Tom Mix was a hero and a good guy in his films, Nazi Tom Mix also wore double holstered pistols, but he would whip them out and shoot prisoners on a whim. I'll just leave it at that. He was responsible for a lot of abuse and torture and just a terrible guy.
So I assume this is somebody you heard about since your earliest days, right? Your father telling you about this guy. How did he express his feelings about him? I mean, I'm intrigued by that.
Yeah, no, I mean, my dad and when Mike, when they were, the two of them were talking, they would just shake their heads, and they didn't talk much about him, but I could tell, I could just tell this guy was absolutely ruthless. So they if we asked questions as kids, they would tell us in all the details. But yeah, a lot of times when Tom Mix would come up, they would just start shaking their heads and kind of, obviously that was a painful memory for them.
And the horror of this, really where this comes from, is there's a culture in these camps that kind of rewards that kind of sadism and really ostracizes those who have any level of kindness. That's the kind of horrible environment that's been created by the SS and their partners who are helping them, sometimes locals, I mean, whoever it would be. It's really the insidious part of this is that sometimes these are not people who were particularly horrible in regular life, but now in this culture they become that. I don't know what the story was with Tom Mix, but a lot of these guards, when you study them, that's part of the tragedy of it too, is just how depraved they've become. I mean, so here's your dad, his best friend, your grandfather, trying to live in this environment. So what is day-to-day life for them now as we get into 1943, 44, of that time period of their incarceration?
Yeah, so they're in the labor camp in Auschwitz, with Auschwitz 3 subcamp Blechhammer, which is an oil refinery producing fuel out of coal for the war effort, German war effort. And so it's a daily, wake up at very early in the morning before sunrise and, rush to the latrines. It's just a massive, and I described the whole thing in the book, but it's just a massive, you're talking about 4,000 Jews people running through, trying to get to the formation on time. If you're not on time to the formation, you're shot. That's it. It's over. So there's a real discipline and structure in that Auschwitz camp. There is no room for anybody doing other than what the Nazis expect of you, what the SS guards expect of you. And then they're marched off. The 4,000 are marched off to this industrial complex, which is the oil refinery. And they work, basically on 1 3-inch square piece of bread for the day. Definitely not enough to sustain hard labor. Work all day in commandos, usually maybe 50 to 100 people to a commando working on various construction projects in and around the camp. Or if you're an engineer, you're taken into the building and working on some other projects that require, some more skill in that area. And of course, they go through their selections, the twice daily selections in that time. And then it's, at the end of the day, it's march back to the camp 3 miles, and then to do it the next day as well. And yeah, they are, they're starved. I think that's one of the things that surprised me was, these guys were chosen for slave labor, yet they were given so little to subsist on. And so certainly there were people dying of starvation, can no longer be of use to the SS. But yeah, they were fed very little. Abuse was constant, as you can read about in the book. Tom Mix and others, by the way. Tom Mix is just my example, honestly, in this book of a guy who was awful. But the truth is, and in all my research, I found many who were as ruthless as Tom Mix. So I don't want to, I definitely didn't want to put them all in there. But to be sure, Tom Mix was not the only one who was bad. But he is the main one I profile in the story. So yeah, very tough existence, trying to live day to day.
And Nina, I think when you talk about Eddie and Mike, and we were reading about them, it truly is against all the odds that they survived. I mean, you read about Tom Mix and all the other circumstances that they're living with when the average lifespan somewhere in like Auschwitz is 6 weeks or something crazy, and they defy the odds over and over again. And it seems to me that in reading it so much, truly their survival was an act of defiance every single day. But what really kept them alive seemed to be their ability to was each other. That it was this, they wanted to stay alive for one another, and that really gave them purpose. And I love that in reading about their story. And I just wondered, at what point when you were growing up, did you begin to hear these stories and understand really what had taken place? Was it something your father always talked about, or was it something that you gradually began to get pieces of this growing up? Just curious how that came about.
I think I was always, I think from my earliest, memory, I was always aware of my father had been through something. He was very open with us. He did answer our questions very openly. And I think probably my first memory is of, something like maybe 5 or 6, seeing the tattoo on his arm, which I'd seen many times, but I finally asked him about it. And I'm sure he said something that was very age appropriate, and said, yeah, I'd been through this thing. And I don't know, somehow I grew up thinking that maybe everybody's father had been through this thing or what, but I didn't see tattoos on their arm, so I started to question it. And eventually you learn more, you ask more, but he was pretty open with it. And you can imagine he's struggling with these memories all the time himself. But he was, I think he felt that we needed to know, his kids needed to know. And so we grew up with all of that. And so I think I probably knew most of the stories by the time I was 16, 17 years old. And so, it had been sitting with me since then. And I was able to process maybe some more difficult things and all that. So by the time I wrote this book, I had been through that process of, emotionally and all of that. Yeah, I think it's interesting too what you say about my dad, mentioning that he was open, because more often than not, I believe people who have been through incredible trauma, it's very hard for them to open up, especially to their children. They really just want to forget about it. Life goes on, have a beautiful life. And that's certainly the case with Holocaust survivors, even veterans of wars, U.S. veterans of all wars, I'm sure. It's very hard for them to talk about these things. They don't want to rehash. But my dad, I think he understood the importance of telling us the stories. And I think it was also good for him to get these stories out of his consciousness a little bit. And also we understood who he was as we grew up. We understood when things bothered him and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I'm very grateful that he was so open with us.
Let's switch back for a minute to the parallel story you're telling in the book. And what happened to Company D during the Battle of the Bulge?
Okay, so Company D was really shocked to have made it to Germany and then to be given orders to drive back to Belgium and into the Ardennes forest. So as you know, the Battle of the Bulge, it's total chaos. No one knows where the front lines are. And somewhere in there, Company D gets trapped and, essentially surrounded by the enemy. Well, they know what happened at Malmedy. Just days earlier, this German SS unit machine gunned over 80, I think it was 84 American POWs, something like that. And so Company D, knowing this, and trapped and cut off from friendly units and essentially surrounded by the enemy. And I really think it's best that you read that one for yourself. But essentially what I can tell you is they get out of this situation thanks to, once again, Elmer rising to the occasion. Ultimately, Lieutenant Hovland is the man who takes the lead in getting them out of what could have been and what would have been likely capture or worse. And it's really after that event that the soldiers in Company D finally see Elmer Hovland as their North Star. And it was at that point, when the company commander is wounded in action, that the senior sergeants basically go marching up to headquarters and tell the battalion commander that they're not following anyone else. When a new company commander is about to be assigned in, they tell the battalion commander they're not following anyone else but Lieutenant Hovland. It's a back and forth with the battalion commander pushing back. I'm sure those of you who have read the book will remember that scene. It's pretty lively. But as a result, Elmer's made the company commander. And yeah, and it goes from there.
Yeah, I mean, he really emerges as sort of the Dick Winters of this story, as by point of comparison. He's clearly a remarkable leader, not just in training in garrison, but in combat where it matters most. That shines through. Like there's this, you really sense this bond of loyalty now that's been created there, and in particular with Pepsi DeCola too, who nominally is quote just a cook, but really isn't. That was another thing that kind of struck me. Is I think cooks sometimes get overlooked in combat stories, and yet he's intimately involved in the combat on a lot of levels. So how does DeCola figure in to Hovland becoming this kind of Olympian figure for D Company, and really honestly kind of for the battalion in a way too? DeCola's a leader in his own way too, in a way, isn't he? I mean, how does he fit in the mix?
Well, he is. And I think, 140 guys, 130 guys at some point, maybe, these two, Elmer Hovland and Pepsi, end up really working in tandem in many ways. They, Elmer Hovland, the lieutenant, and another lieutenant, Charles Myers, and Pepsi really are the ones who sort of keep this unit on task, solid, together, coming together. The group is more important than the individual. This mantra from Lieutenant Hovland, and Pepsi just rides in tandem with Elmer Hovland's leadership. And exactly like you said, he runs the kitchen, but he's so much more than that. And what was remarkable to me was how both of these kids, and talking to their families and learning how they started out as these very ordinary, simple young boys, and how they evolved in war, and how they stepped up to the task and just became these figures in this story that just rose to the occasion. And it's really remarkable how they work together. Yeah.
It is, and in that sense, it's a coming-of-age story, and it's microcosmic for who knows how many others in World War II, in all these different combat units all along the Battle of the Bulge and then many other theaters. It's endlessly amazing to me to see what happens with a lot of these guys who do come of age like this, and leaders who emerge, and you really do sense that with D Company. So you get them, through the Bulge, and then obviously they're going to be going into Germany, and then of course the parallel of the story is what's happening now with your father and Mike and your grandfather. So unfortunately now we reach sort of the climax of this horror that they've experienced. The Soviets are advancing, getting closer to uncovering and ending a lot of the death camps in Poland. And that's happening now as you get into early 1945. So how does that affect, your father and Mike's experience, and also what has happened with your grandfather in the meantime by the time all of this starts to play out?
Right. So basically the war goes on through 1944. Auschwitz Blechhammer, the oil refinery where Eddie and Mike and Siegfried are prisoners, is bombed by American B-24s a number of times. There's a whole story there, which is absolutely amazing, and was so great to be able to research and bring you those stories of the B-24s. By the way, in the second bombing, the Tuskegee Airmen were escort on that mission. But anyway, I digress. Also, actually, a young 22-year-old pilot, George McGovern, remember him, ran for president in 1972. He was a 22-year-old pilot on one of those missions over Blechhammer. In fact, that was the last mission. Anyway, I do digress. Sorry. That's what researchers do. I think we get all these little tidbits, and we love it. But eventually the Soviets are approaching this massive Auschwitz complex. So the SS put the prisoners on this mass exodus out of the area to move them westward, where tens of thousands of prisoners, I believe it was something like 29 camps. It puts them on a march towards Germany in the middle of a freezing Polish winter. So this is now January 1945. It's a grueling march through heavy snowdrifts, wearing only, frayed blue and white striped uniforms and clogs. Of course, the SS are comfortably wearing their heavy winter coats. And the SS are shooting prisoners who are stumbling, who can't keep up. Some of those prisoners are trying to avoid stumbling and to be shot, and are actually removing their clogs and taking chances walking in their bare feet for the rest of the way. But anyway, just fast forward. That's quite an interesting part of the book, I think. Just remarkable. But 13 days later, the survivors of that death march, and they do lose a lot along the way, from just passing out and being shot to others who just can't walk anymore. But 13 days afterwards, the survivors of that death march, including Eddie and Mike, have made it, and they are eventually moved to a subcamp of Buchenwald, which, and they end up in the Harz Mountains at a camp called Langenstein, where some 5,000 prisoners, and these are prisoners from all over. So the first camp, Blechhammer, was really Jewish, 4,000 Jewish prisoners. This is 5,000 prisoners from all over Central and Eastern Europe, put to work on a massive project, an underground tunnel, in a project that the SS call Project Malachite, or Commando Malachite. It's camouflaged from above by a dense forest. This was a top secret priority project where slave labor is forced to build a huge network of tunnels miles long, where once they are built, will house workshops for Hitler's new wonder weapons to try to turn the tide of the war back in Germany's favor. So, new kind of airplane engine that uses jet technology to power Germany's new fleet of Messerschmitts and other things. And also would produce parts for the V-2 rocket, which was being built by slave labor at nearby Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. But anyway, so this work was incredibly dangerous, and slave labor prisoners are blasting tunnels with no protection. The Nazis are driving the prisoners to work at a frenetic pace because Hitler wants these tunnels built as fast as possible. So there's no regard for human life here. And it's something like, I was looking at the rolls because they had to turn in rolls of who was killed that day by your registration number. And it turned out to be something like 50 prisoners a day are dying to get this project finished. Because of the top secret nature of the project, no inmate can be allowed to get out to tell anyone what's going on inside the tunnel. So no inmate leaves Langenstein alive. So without giving too much away, in this camp, this is the camp where both boys become get very close to losing their lives. Life expectancy is actually 6 weeks in this camp. The boys survive 8 weeks before they are put on a death march as the Americans are approaching.
Nina, can you tell us a little bit about Eddie and Mike and how in terms of after that, they finally do make an escape? And I know without giving away too much, but we want to kind of show them as they get to Company D at some point. But can you tell us how they escape? It's just a remarkable split-second decision and how that happens.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't want to give it away if you haven't read the book. But what I can say is this. So the boys, while they're still in Langenstein, they make a pact with 4 other prisoners who want to escape from the death march that they are about to go on. But the SS, on this march, the SS is vigilant, very heavily armed. Everyone has got a machine gun, very heavily armed and with attack dogs to make sure that no one escapes from the march. And at some point, and again, it's an incredible moment, that the team bolts. There's a chaotic scene that follows, but they get away, run into a river. Eddie is actually shot. Mike is attacked by a dog. But at some point, they are just able to take off. And I think I should leave it there.
Well, again, I know you don't want to give away too much of it, so I'll just encourage our listeners to get the book and find out more about it. But yeah, can you kind of hint how do your stories converge? How do they meet up with Company D and Elmer and Pepsi?
Well, at this point, Eddie and Mike, as you can imagine, are absolutely skeletal and absolutely spent. They had barely lived through the Langenstein Tunnels project. They're down to 70, 75 pounds. And now they're wounded as well. So they're pretty much moving on adrenaline, and they just keep running towards the sounds of the front, which takes days, but sleeping in the woods, trying to hide out during the day, and running towards the sounds of the front at night. Eventually, Eddie and Mike, another great scene that I won't share with you here, but Eddie and Mike and Company D find each other. And how were they received? Yeah, that's a good question. So that is an epic moment in the story. What I can say is the soldiers were shocked. I think for everyone who was there in that moment, time stood still. One of those soldiers told me, we weren't even sure what we were looking at. Babyface Vance, was stunned at how Eddie and Mike was not much younger than he was. And I think that impressed them all. For Eddie and Mike, you can imagine that moment for them after 5 years of captivity in internment and concentration camps, starving and having been abused for those 5 years. They're finally in the hands of the men who had come to defeat the Nazis. And so that's one thing. But what I think is really interesting about the next moment is that the soldiers, especially frontline soldiers, were given instructions, specific instructions to bypass any refugees they encountered along the way because, well, they're fighting on the front lines. They're on an aggressive schedule, the momentum of battle, and they have orders to bypass all refugees. But the Lieutenant Elmer Hovland, in that one moment, makes a decision that will change everyone's lives when he defies those orders and takes the two boys into his care. He gets them moved to the rear, cleaned up, their wounds cleaned up, and tended to, deloused, change of clothes, and then basically brings them into the unit and makes them part of the unit. And the entire company takes part in bringing the two boys back to life. And it's this sort of big brother, little brother relationship takes root. And they stay together for 6 months. And in that time, the lieutenant somehow even gets them on the Army payroll when he puts Eddie and Mike to work and in the unit. And Pepsi really takes control of bringing the two boys back to life, physically and emotionally. And the rest of the boys at Company D also all become part of this incredible story.
Yeah, and of course, this kind of thing is happening all over Germany at that point, and in many cases, most cases, the Americans really don't know how to care for people that undernourished and that severely traumatized, and often make the mistake of giving them very rich food, C rations, K rations, and whatever else we've got. Pepsi unfortunately doesn't like fall down that trap, which could have been deadly to your father. So how does he nurture these guys, and how does that draw on who he is and his understanding of food and nutrition?
Well, I say in the book with Pepsi, when Elmer said, get them to the kitchen and put them to work, make sure they eat. This Pepsi, when he first saw the boys, it just broke his heart wide open, and he took it personally. He believed that Elmer was saying, "Save these boys," so he took it very personally, and he was scared to death to try to, really afraid he was going to do something wrong or, as you said, overfeed or whatever. So he took it very, very slowly. He started out with some, very, very simple foods, and which didn't work out so well the first time. And then he learned from that. But he was so invested in trying to make sure that these boys not only made it through that first day, but then they made it through 2 days and then a week and then another week. Mike and Eddie's recollection is that he just did an unbelievably beautiful job. They didn't have English at that time. They learned English in those 6 months with these guys, but they could understand Pepsi very clearly. He had a kind look in his eye. He was always jumping around trying to see what he could do next for the boys, slept next to them on cots, would get up at night to make sure they were still breathing and that sort of thing. So he was critical in those first couple weeks.
Nina, I just when you're talking about this, it just reminds me that it's apparent that Company D, of course, helped save Mike and Eddie, but it also just seems that these two young men, Mike and Eddie, helped save the men of Company D because they were so they had become so hardened to the war, and yet here's a situation that allows them to see the evidence of why they're fighting, which I think gave them the courage and willpower to keep going, that this was the evidence standing right in front of them. And, I don't know, I don't know if your father talked much about that piece of it. I mean, because it certainly was a brotherhood at that point. Did he talk about how some of the men in the unit felt finally seeing kind of this incredible evidence, which of course they would see a lot more after that, but how that impacted them moving forward to the rest of the war?
Yeah, he didn't. My father didn't really tell me about that, but the veterans did. They a couple of them said, they were as they were going through the war and finding out that the Sherman was not, what they expected it to be, and having gone through the struggles that they went through in the war, watching their buddies die, they questioned. Some of them questioned what they were doing and why they were there and what was the purpose of this whole thing. So most definitely when a few of them told me that when they saw Eddie and Mike, it became clear to them that they had done a good thing. They were here for a reason. And then when Elmer insisted they be scooped up into the company, they helped Eddie and Mike essentially over a period of time kind of bring them back to life. I think they understood that they were doing a good thing, and they did. They looked at Eddie and Mike as they were coming back to life and realized that not only had they done a good thing, but that the importance of really the American character and this idea about compassion and what that means and who we are as Americans, and what we do. And, we're on the right side of history, but we're also, doing good things and doing it for humanity. And so they all got that.
So, those are, listening to the story, you hear about the two boys who have now, in a sense, been saved by themselves and their ability to escape, but also by linking up with D Company and becoming part of D Company, and really that brotherhood as you alluded to. But you may notice that, your grandfather is not part of this. So, just by way of, I don't know that you have to go deep into the story because everyone needs to read the book, but just in terms of closing the loop with him, unfortunately, he's not along for this part of it, is he?
He is not. Yeah, I really think it's best to read that for yourself, but you're right. He's not. He actually doesn't make it past the camp in Auschwitz.
Yeah, and it's just horrifying and so poignant too. Again, I'd urge everybody to read the book. So when the war ends, that 6 months goes by, and these guys too, by the way, the adaptability to learn English and learn American culture, American ways. Now they're basically part of the unit in a way. They're becoming military themselves in a way. So when the war ends and Mike and Eddie go on about their lives, what happens next for them?
Well, after the war ends, as I said, they were together for 6 months. The boys of Company D eventually have to go back home to the United States, and they can't take Eddie and Mike with them. So they all say goodbye to each other. It's a very heavy scene, and they all go their own ways. And Eddie and Mike go back to their hometowns. Eddie to Mönchengladbach in Germany, Mike to Amsterdam. And, they go back home hoping to find someone else from their families, come home alive. But as it turned out, they find out that no one else survived. By the way, records years later would show that they were the only two survivors in their families. So after about a year, the two boys apply to get to the U.S. Eventually, they are given the green light to go to America. They get to the U.S. when they're about 18, 19 years old. And with no one to take them in, they're too old for an orphanage, but having learned enough English to, in their time with Company D, they pass a language test and they join the military. Eddie in the Army, Mike in the Air Force, and the military becomes their new families. And eventually Eddie goes to OCS, Officer Candidate School, becomes an officer. Mike becomes a Master Sergeant in the Air Force. And Eddie, by the way, in one of his first jobs as a brand new lieutenant, is posted to Germany to become the first American liaison to the newly formed German CIA. Both boys marry, have children, stay in close contact with each other for the rest of your lives, as you can imagine. They remain very close, like very close brothers for the rest of their lives.
I mean, that's the part that's among many that's just so moving and amazing to me, because we've seen this, as a Holocaust story, as a leadership story, a family story. It's an immigrant story too, because not every DP had that experience of eventually being able to come to America. America's doors were closed for a lot of people in the late 1940s who might have had lives like this. And then here are these two guys who come to America, become part of American ways, and then give back with their own military service. Your father, a long career, of course, not just in the Army, but obviously Intel too. So this is how we kind of close the loop too with your mother's story. And again, this is what I find so moving. We see through this book your father in that role of, for lack of a better way to put it, victim, prisoner and victim and almost dying. And now he comes back as an American, and here's your mother encountering him. I wonder if you could just kind of address that a little bit, because this is your origin story. This is where you come from. I mean, how does that all come together for your parents in that?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah. So my mother, again, this is all laid out in my book, 40 Autumns, but my mother had escaped East Germany, the only one in her family to do so, family of 9 children and her parents who stayed trapped behind the Iron Curtain. She escaped and made her way to Heidelberg and learned English as fast as she could. I think it took her 2 years to get good enough to get a job at the headquarters at Heidelberg, the U.S. Army headquarters at Heidelberg, and she became a secretary. My father, meantime, came back to Germany as a young lieutenant. Actually, it's kind of a cute story how they actually met, because my mother at that time was sort of a very sought after secretary, shall we say, by some of the GIs who noticed her, and they would pass by her desk and try out their German, in terrible German, terrible accents. Good morning, Fräulein, just really bad. And she noticed that, and she wasn't interested in dating or anything like that. But along comes a lieutenant with sparkling eyes, as the story goes. And he would walk by her desk and say, good morning, Fräulein, in German, and then would go on further to say, hey, what's in that big bag you're always carrying? Or he would say something, what's that on your desk? And she became intrigued at the fact that there was this American soldier without an accent, spoke fluent German because he's German. And one day she finally cracked and asked him and said, Lieutenant Willner, I have to ask, how is it possible that you speak German without an American accent? It is just fluent. And his answer was, well, we have very good schools in America. So very good language schools in America. And, that was sort of the beginning of it. It wasn't until later that he told her who he was, that he was actually a survivor. And, as the story goes, she was alone in the world. She was not in contact with her family. She couldn't be. He was alone in the world, certainly. And so I think they found found in each other. Certainly, their stories resonated with each other, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
It
is really amazing. And then, obviously, you and your siblings come to being as they start a family in America, and lives and careers, and time passes, and your family, and of course your father, always wondering about these guys from D Company, and the long search of trying to find them. So as we kind of wrap up here, they eventually do have a reunion, right? So how does that happen, and what's that like? Because you saw that too, didn't you? You were
right.
Well,
exactly.
So in this sense, you're a witness to it.
Yeah. So after they came to America, Eddie and Mike, they not initially, but they looked for them eventually, the boys of Company D, because but they just couldn't find them, because they really all they had were nicknames that they recalled, like Fats and Stubbins and Hard Rock and Pepsi. How are you going to find a guy named Pepsi? Anyway, as I said, I grew up with these stories of these men who saved my dad, Eddie and Mike. And while I thought of them as being giants 10 feet tall, my dad insisted they were just ordinary Americans. But I always remember hoping that and believing that someday we would meet them. But it didn't look like it was going to happen. So my dad and mom looked for these guys wherever they could. They spent years writing to various military units, everything they could think of, but they just never found them. Meanwhile, the old soldiers of Company D had been reuniting almost every year since the war. Redhead Fred told me that he had always wondered what happened to, quote, those two little Jewish boys we picked up. They all mentioned, they always wondered, they always brought it up at every reunion. Remember those two kids who, So anyway, fast forward to around the year 2000. I won't go into too much detail here again, but they find each other. And let me tell you, that was one heck of a reunion. It was, covered on the front page of the Washington Post and other national news magazines. And I think I should really just leave that one there. Yeah.
Well, I highly recommend everybody to read the book. You just have to. It's fascinating. It's called The Boys in the Light, an extraordinary World War II story of survival, faith, and brotherhood. It's just one of the most moving and affecting World War II and beyond books that I've read in a long time. Nina Willner, the author, it's been a pleasure to have you. Thanks for joining us.
It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
John Long, please tell us about today's We Salute You.
Today on our We Salute You feature, we honor a brave American sailor who died approaching the shore of Omaha Beach on D-Day, trying to do a vital job to contribute to victory. John Thomas O'Donnell was born in Hamburg, New York on January 9, 1922. Like nearly all able-bodied men of his generation, he stood ready to defend his nation and accordingly enlisted in the U.S. Navy 8 months before Pearl Harbor. He was assigned to the 6th Naval Beach Battalion as a pharmacist mate and trained for a challenging assignment to land on a hostile beach during an amphibious assault and to work under fire, keeping the shoreline clear of debris, obstacles, wounded men, and enemy guns. By 1944, his battalion was ordered to land on D-Day on a beach codenamed Omaha. Surviving evidence indicates O'Donnell was killed by enemy fire as his landing craft approached the beach, and his body returned to England, never having reached France. He was buried in Brookwood Cemetery, today the Cambridge American Cemetery in England, on June 7, 1944. However, subsequently, and with no explanation, his date of death was amended to June 8th, a date reflected on his grave marker in New York to this day. However, evidence suggests his original death date was the correct one. On the 4th of July, 1944, O'Donnell's company commander wrote a letter to his grieving sister, Rose Mahoney. He noted that John was killed instantly on D-Day and praised him as, quote, a good sailor man and good American who wasn't afraid to die that his country might live. He died in the best traditions of the service. Last Memorial Day and again on June 6th, the National D-Day Memorial honored John O'Donnell by featuring his compelling story in our commemorations and by adding his name to our necrology wall of Allied servicemen who died on June 6, 1944 in the Normandy invasion. With these additions, there are currently 4,436 names on our wall, of whom 2,519 are Americans. As we honored them earlier this summer, we reminded our audience of the stirring words of the great patriotic hymn, "O beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life." Pharmacist mate John Thomas O'Donnell, we salute you. Thank you for your service, and thank you for doing your part to save the world.
And as the rating indicated, he was probably a medic and doing a job we a lot of times overlook when we talk about the landings at Omaha Beach, the beach battalions, the naval beach battalions that had, like you said, that job of clearing out so much debris and through the obstacle belts and keeping the sea lanes open for the landing craft to get there. I mean, it was one heck of a job and a real mess.
How many challenges? Because not only are you being fired at, but the initial landings are at low tide. So through the day, the tide is coming in, meaning the beach is getting narrower, but it's also getting more clogged with debris, wounded men, wreckage. And it's the beach battalions that have to keep all that clear. And so many people don't even know who they are, because you look at the photos and they're dressed as soldiers. You can't tell that these guys are actually in the U.S. Navy. But it's really a heroic tale that I like to tell on tours when I'm giving them at the memorial, and make sure they get their due.
Well, they don't enough, and it's just incredible. So many of them. I've talked to a family not long ago of one who was in the Naval Beach Battalion, but he was so traumatized the rest of his life. It was just everything he had seen as he was crossing the beach, which was horrific. He described some of it, but never talked about it to his family ever. But it really affected him for the rest of his days. So,
yeah, he wasn't the only one.
Yeah.
I'm glad in Saving Private Ryan they show them briefly.
Right.
Yeah.
Just they pop up. Yeah.
Just to pop up and you can see them. I mean, you can see in the helmet the orange curve on some of the helmet. Yeah, the stripe. And for some of the other Navy guys too, like in the demolition units, they'd have the gray paint on their helmets, but that was about the only way to tell them as sailors. They look like anybody else.
Yeah.
Sure. And then there are sailors out in the channel on landing craft that are hit or sunk. And so it's not just the guys on the beach, but it's, a lot of times I don't want to say overemphasize, but we are only aware of the soldiers, and we forget about the sailors and, frankly, sometimes the airmen as well.
Yeah, I'm as guilty of it as anybody. Absolutely. And much less the destroyers, too. They're doing amazing work.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Yeah. Another great story.
Yep. Well, speaking of great stories, we want to thank again our guest today, Nina Willner, author of Boys in the Light. Please read that book. It's just amazing. Nina, it's been just an honor to have you today.
Amazing.
Thank you. Really enjoyed being with you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Go get your book today, everyone.
Do. You'll like it. And then email our team at podcast@dday.org and tell us what you think. Again, podcast@dday.org. If you're enjoying our discussions on World War II and its lasting impact, please subscribe to this podcast. Share it with your friends. Rate it. Leave us a review. We love to hear from you. Help us share the lessons and legacies of D-Day and World War II. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Take care.
Someone Talked is a production of the National D-Day Memorial Foundation, recorded at Media Squatch in Bedford, Virginia. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the foundation, studio, or sponsors. Promotional consideration for Someone Talked is provided by Framatome, an international leader in nuclear energy. Learn more at framatome.com. Explore the National D-Day Memorial, plan your visit, and learn more about our educational programming and upcoming events at dday.org. Join the conversation. Email our team at podcast@dday.org. So long from all of us at Someone Talked.